Math 1332, Chapter 3, Symbolic Logic, Section 4, Logical Arguments, Video 8, Common Fallacies, the Fallacy of the Converse. The previous 4 videos, we discovered some common valid argument forms. Now it's time to look at some that are common but not so valid. In video 3 of this series, we determined the validity of the following argument using the truth table method. You might remember this example. Premise 1, if I get a pay raise at work, then I will take my family on vacation. Premise 2, I took my family on vacation. Conclusion, I got a pay raise at work. Many people, dare I say most people, would draw that conclusion from these 2 premises. However, well, we'll hold off on the however for a second. Hello, Kitty. The symbolic representation of this argument was the following. The first premise was P pointing to Q, and in this particular example, the simple statement P was, I get a pay raise at work, and Q was, I will take my family on vacation. The second premise was, I took my family on vacation, which although is in the past tense, is still conveying the same idea as Q. And the conclusion was, therefore, I got a pay raise at work. However, using the truth table method, we determined that this argument was invalid. This means the conclusion does not logically follow from the premises, neither in the specific case, I got a pay raise at work, which I meant to highlight in yellow up here. 1 second. Mouse is being a little bit persnickety. There we go. So the conclusion does not logically follow from the premise, neither in the specific case, which was I got a pay raise at work, or the general case, which was just P. So we've already hashed this out as an invalid argument. So why do so many people incorrectly draw this conclusion? The answer lies in variations on the conditional. In the 3rd section of this chapter, we talked about types of statements, and one type of statement was variations of the conditional. Recall that the converse of a conditional is formed by switching the antecedent and the consequent. For example, the converse of if I get a pay raise at work, then I will take my family on vacation is if I take my family on vacation, then I got a pay raise at work. Again, you can be a little bit liberal with the verb tenses. The yellow one went from present tense to past tense, but regardless, that's the converse of this statement. Also recall that in general, the converse is not logically equivalent to the original conditional. That means that the last columns in the truth tables of P pointing to Q and Q pointing to P do not match. Thus, you cannot just arbitrarily replace a conditional with its converse and expect everything to be okay. But what if you did? A lot of people think that these 2 conditionals, which I'm about to put boxes around, a lot of people think that these 2 conditionals mean the exact same thing. They do not. But what if they did, and what if you replaced the first premise in this argument with its converse? Now, right now, the converse isn't formed, but I wanted you to see what it looked like now and what it looks like after I switch them. So here it is now, and here it is after we switch the antecedent and the consequent to form the converse. Now, does this look familiar? When we replace the conditional with its converse, look at the structure of the argument now. The antecedent is I take my family on vacation. The consequent is I got a pay raise at work. The second premise is the original antecedent. This is the law of detachment. Thought there was something here for me to delete, but I guess not. This is the law of detachment. If you could replace a conditional with its converse, then the conclusion would be valid. The conclusion being, and my apologies, I thought it was written there. That's better. Because again, if you could replace the conditional with its converse, then this would be the law of detachment and the conclusion would be valid. But you can't replace a conditional with its converse, so it isn't a valid argument. Because people incorrectly assume a converse is logically equivalent to its original conditional, they draw an invalid conclusion in this situation. Hence, this invalid argument form is called the fallacy of the converse. So I introduced to you common fallacy number 1, the fallacy of the converse. Symbolically, the fallacy of the converse says, if you have a conditional for the first premise, and the consequent of that conditional is the second premise, then the conclusion is the antecedent. But be careful, this is a fallacy, and I don't think I've formally defined fallacy, but fallacy is simply an invalid argument form. Like all argument forms, this also, hold on. The fallacy of the converse also has a descriptive form, just making sure that what was under there is what I thought was under there. The, well, it's supposed to be hidden here. Here it is. The first premise, descriptively, is if some antecedent, then some consequent. And of course, the word then is misspelled, and we got that fixed. The second premise is simply whatever the consequent was. And the conclusion is whatever the antecedent was. Oops. So, if you have an argument of this form, a premise that is a conditional, another premise that matches the consequent, and a conclusion that matches the antecedent, this is a bad, invalid argument. It's called the fallacy of the converse, and the conclusion is invalid. So let's take a look at what this might look like in your homework. Determine if the following is a valid argument. Premise number 1, if my cat gets spayed, then she will not have kittens. Premise number 2, my cat did not have kittens. Conclusion, my cat got spayed. Again, most people would say that's a conclusion that you can draw. Yes, we're talking about you, except you didn't have kittens. But let's analyze the structure of this argument. The first premise is a conditional whose antecedent is, I have no idea why the word I is in there. That's a little bit better. The antecedent of the first premise is my cat gets spayed, which matches the conclusion of the argument in the past tense. My cat got spayed. The consequent of the first premise is she will not have kittens, which matches the second premise. My cat did not have kittens. This is the fallacy of the converse. Notice the coloring, and notice the coloring there. By the way, you don't have to use colors to do this. It just adds another layer of taking the information in. So this is precisely the structure for the fallacy of the converse, and as a consequence, it is an invalid argument. It looks good. People will draw this conclusion all the time, and every time their conclusion is invalid. Now, that doesn't mean the conclusion is false. Make that clear. The premise 1 is true for my cat. Premise 2 is true for my cat. The conclusion is true for my cat. But as an argument form, it is invalid. If all you know is if my cat gets spayed, then she won't have kittens, and my cat didn't have kittens, you cannot conclude that the cat got spayed because she may not have had kittens for other reasons. Maybe she has an issue with her reproductive organs. Maybe she's never been around a male cat. Or other reasons why she may not have had kittens besides getting spayed. But people make this type of invalid conclusion all the time. Listen for it and you'll hear it. Let's take a look at a symbolic example, which is a lot more disguised because you have a bunch of junk thrown into these premises. But look closely at the structure of the argument to go, this might be something I can connect to a common argument form, whether it's valid or invalid. Notice that the first premise is a conditional. And as a consequence, its antecedent as a consequence, its antecedent and consequent might be elsewhere in the argument. The antecedent of the conditional in the first premise is R biconditional negation Q, which exactly matches the conclusion. The antecedent of the conditional in the first premise is Q disjunction P, which is precisely the second premise. So regardless of what Q, P, and R represent, or regardless of any word context which would translate symbolically into this argument, this is the fallacy of the converse. Look at the coloring here, look at the coloring there, look at the coloring there. And more importantly, look at the wording here. The antecedent at the beginning matches the conclusion at the end. The consequent at the beginning matches the second premise. No matter how you look at it, that's exactly what we have here. So any way you look at it, this argument is invalid by the fallacy of the converse. So let's summarize. The fallacy of the converse means the following is an invalid argument form. In symbolic form, if the first premise is a conditional with an antecedent of P and a consequent of Q, and the second premise is also that consequent Q, and the conclusion is P, the original antecedent, this is an invalid argument form. You cannot draw that conclusion logically. Same thing in the descriptive form. If your first premise is if some antecedent, then some consequent, there's another misspelled then, and your second premise is whatever the consequent was, and your conclusion is whatever the antecedent was, this is the fallacy of the converse. It's an invalid argument form. Keep an ear open for it. You'll hear people draw these types of bad conclusions all the time, but it's not the only fallacy that people fall for. I got two more to show you.